Hello, I'm Cameo George, executive producer of American Experience, PBS's longest running and most watched history series. Thank you for joining us today. Today's conversation is inspired by our film, The Codebreaker, the fascinating story of the brilliant woman whose painstaking work decoding thousands of messages for the US government sent infamous gangsters to prison and brought down a massive Nazi spy ring in World War II. A suburban wife and mother, she led a secret double life that would only come to light decades after her death when classified government files were unsealed. We'll discuss her groundbreaking achievements, the frustrations and professional slights she endured as a woman in a so-called man's world, and how the science and technology space has evolved today to better empower women to participate and lead. This is meant to be an interactive conversation, so I invite you to write questions to our panelists and our moderator in the chat box. We'll answer as many as possible during the conversation. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our corporate sponsors, Liberty Mutual Insurance and Consumer Cellular. I'd also like to acknowledge the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, the Documentary Investment Group, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, our home station GBH, and of course, viewers like you. Now, I am pleased to introduce our panelists and moderator for this conversation. Jason Fagone is a journalist at the San Francisco Chronicle and author of the book, The Woman Who Smashed Codes, the inspiration for our film. Jason has covered technology, sports, and culture for the Huffington Post and has written for the New York Times Magazine, Wired, and GQ. Next up, Valeria and Kyara Torres-Olivares. They are sisters and co-founders of CODE-EQUAL, a nonprofit organization that provides free computer science courses, workshops, and mentorship to support self-identifying girls and underrepresented minorities who want to enter computer science fields. Both are alums of Code with Klossy, a free coding camp for girls aged 13 to 18, founded by model and entrepreneur Karlie Kloss. Kyara is currently a student at Princeton High School, and Valeria is currently a sophomore at Princeton University, studying public policy and computer science. Our moderator for today is Adriane Lentz-Smith, an associate professor and associate chair of Duke University's Department of History, where she teaches courses on the Civil Rights Movement, Black Lives, Modern America, and history in fact and fiction. She is author of Freedom Struggles, African Americans and World War I, and the upcoming book, The Slow Death of Saigon Pen, State Violence and the Twilight of Civil Rights. Adriane has also appeared in several American Experience films, including the upcoming Voice of Freedom, which focuses on singer Marian Anderson and her historic 1939 concert at the Lincoln Memorial. Thank you again, and please enjoy the conversation.
For joining us this afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to you and welcome to Jason, Valeria, and Kyara for this conversation. So we're just going to get started. We're going to delve into the story of a woman unsung in her time and unknown in ours, whose painstaking work to decode thousands of messages for the US government would send infamous gangsters to prison in the Prohibition era and bring down a massive, near invisible Nazi spy ring during World War II. Based on the book, The Woman Who Smashed Codes by Jason Fagone, who is here with us this afternoon. The Codebreaker tells the story of Elizabeth Friedman, the crypto analyst whose remarkable contributions would come to light only decades after her death, when secret government files were unsealed. Her story is remarkable, but it's also full of moments where she faced discrimination and found her accomplishments co-opted or downplayed simply because she was a woman doing brilliant work, but in a man's world. So we're going to watch a quick preview of the film now, and then we'll come back and have a conversation about it.
She was a suburban mom, but she lived a double life.
She had the ability to see beyond what most other people could.
She was a code-breaking Quaker poet who hunted Nazi spies. And with the invention of radio, the world's secrets are flying through the ether.
The United States had no code-breaking agency. There was no NSA, there was no CIA.
She figured out methods of solving secret messages that had never been imagined before.
She's being asked to break codes for the United States military in a world war. This is as deep as on-the-job training gets.
She begins the development of strategic intelligence. She was really visionary.
The Germans have no idea that the spy ring was broken up because their codes have been broken.
One of the headlines in a story that she appeared in was "Solved by Woman."
They don't talk about her ability to break these codes. They talk about how she's this dainty little woman.
Elizabeth's story remained untold for so long, mainly because of sexism and secrecy.
And if we could miss something as big as Elizabeth, who else are we missing?
So there is much remarkable about Elizabeth Friedman's story. And one of the most striking things is that we didn't know it or anything about her until recently. Jason, can you tell us a bit about how you uncovered this story and what inspired you to write The Woman Who Smashed Codes?
Yeah, I love telling this story. It makes me remember a very happy time in my life when I was first kind of discovering Elizabeth and started teaching myself about all of her adventures. So first, I just want to thank the American Experience team for setting up this talk and of course for the wonderful documentary. I think it will help win Elizabeth some new fans, and she definitely deserves that. And Valeria, Kyara, and Adriane, I'm glad to be talking to you about Elizabeth today, and I'm really curious to hear what you have to say. So the short version of this story of how I became an Elizabeth Friedman super fan is that it started kind of by accident. 2013, 2014, I was reading a book about a famous man. And in reading about this famous man, there was a mention of his wife. And just from the few details of his wife's career and her life, it seemed like she had a very interesting life of her own, maybe even a more interesting life than the life of her husband, but I couldn't find any information about her. The famous man was William Friedman. He is said to be the greatest American codebreaker of all time. He's not famous in the sense that he's a household name, but in intelligence circles and history circles, he's a pretty big name. He was a war hero in World War II. He was said to be the founder of the National Security Agency, this big government intelligence agency. So I was reading a book about William, and it mentioned that his wife, Elizabeth, was also a codebreaker, someone who solves puzzles without knowing the key. And it said specifically that she broke codes during the Rum War, during Prohibition for the US Coast Guard, and she went after these gangsters. And I thought, that sounds pretty interesting. You know, I want to know more. But again, I couldn't really find any information about her. And so one day I lied to my boss. I said that I was sick. I basically played hooky. And I drove down to the George Marshall Foundation Library in Virginia, where Elizabeth had left a collection of her papers before she died in 1980. I went there because I had just seen online that the library had a collection of Elizabeth's letters, but it didn't have any information about what was in them. So I went to the library. I asked them, you know, what's in Elizabeth's collection? And there was this moment, and I'll always remember it. It was like a pretty big day in my life. They took me into this room, and there was a metal door, and it was like a really thick metal door. I imagine it was kind of like the metal door that you would see in an old-timey bank vault or something. And they opened this vault and led me into the vault. And it was a humidity-controlled room where they kept a lot of their most important records. And the archivist pointed to a shelf, and there were 22 gray boxes that said the Elizabeth Smith Friedman collection on them. So Elizabeth had given 22 boxes of things to the library before she died, but there was not really any information about what was in those 22 boxes. There wasn't like an annotated guide to them. The only way to find out what was in them was to start looking at them. And so I just decided to start looking at box one. And so I took box one and I began looking at these pages that Elizabeth had left behind. And as soon as I started reading her letters and her documents, this incredible story kind of leapt off the pages. You know, that very first day, I saw some of her code worksheets from Prohibition when she was solving puzzles with pencil and paper, you know, having to do with rum runners shipping, you know, booze on the high seas, names of ships and ship captains. You know, this was all before the era of computers. It was all pencil and paper. I remember that first day I read some of her love letters from when she was in her 20s, and she and William were just falling in love with each other. And I got to tell you, when you read love letters that are 100 years old, you know, it's not like, you know, emoji, heart, I love you. It's actually like 20 pages of devoted description of why somebody loves each other. And at the end of some of these love letters, Elizabeth and William would include a little sign off that was written in code. And so I was going through these materials and I realized, you know, all of a sudden that this incredibly lucky thing had happened to me that every journalist and author always is hoping will happen to them.
And historian.
You know, I had just stumbled into this untold story, right? And from there, my mission was really just, I have to try to tell this. I have to tell this story as best I can.
I mean, that is really a historian's dream story, right? And I love that it begins with, you're going down one path with a certain kind of curiosity. It sparks a question and you follow that question into a discovery. That's really gorgeous. And I'll also say, I love that she gave 22 boxes, because that's someone that, as unknown as her story might be, she knew that it was significant and she knew that she mattered.
Exactly.
Valeria and Kyara, I wonder, what do you think about Elizabeth, about her story? And what aspects of it were surprising or shocking or inspirational to you when you learned it?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, very happy to be here. Thank you for having us. Super excited to be in conversation with both of you. And in terms of like her story, very thankful for Jason for actually uncovering it. I wish that I'd heard about it when I was younger, because it was really a privilege to learn about it through the book and also the film. Learning also how she comes from like a non-traditional background and being able to have so much impact in her field, specifically because of her intersectional background and her views, was really, really inspirational, especially for me and Kyara, just because I know we both have a lot of interests outside of computer science. But it was also just a little bit shocking and almost sad that we hadn't learned about her in history classes or even computer science classes when we first were discussing and learning about cryptology. I wish I had. It was really cool.
Yeah, I was really surprised at the fact that I hadn't, you know, heard about her, especially because of like the impact that she had made and is making on, you know, advancing the cryptology field. Everything she did, you know, we still see today. And I think that's really important, you know, the way that she kind of like took her knowledge and she kept going, even though she was facing a lot of like discrimination and hardships throughout her career. I think it was really inspiring, and I hope that everyone gets to know who she is.
Yeah. And as that historian said at the end of the documentary, if we don't know her, it makes you wonder, what are the other things that we don't know? Who are the other people?
Yeah, exactly.
Don't know. As Kyara mentioned, Elizabeth Friedman's tenacity is one of the most striking characteristics of her. She pushed forward and created new possibilities, new fields even, throughout her career, despite the indignities, the roadblocks, and the occasional sabotage that she encountered. As we see in the documentary, even some of Elizabeth's biggest successes were marred by sexism. Let's take a look at another clip when Elizabeth testifies as the key witness in a trial against rum smugglers or rum runners during Prohibition.
At the trial in New Orleans, prosecutors called upon Elizabeth to testify against some of the most dangerous men in the country.
There were a lot of Prohibition agents who had already been killed in the line of duty.
There are these plainclothes people that she doesn't know that are there to keep her from being whacked by the bad guys. But it wouldn't have occurred to her not to testify against them. These people had to be put away. That was the whole point of breaking the codes.
When Elizabeth took the stand, she was grilled mercilessly by Al Capone's attorneys, who worked to undermine her credibility.
Whenever Elizabeth tried to explain how she solved the messages, these 6 lawyers, men, would often stand up and object and say that it was some kind of witchcraft, that code breaking was not science, that Elizabeth was just making a guess. She got so fed up with the repeated objections of the defense attorneys that she asked a judge if she could have access to a blackboard. And Elizabeth proceeded to give a class in code breaking. And by the time she was finished, the defense attorneys had nothing else to say.
They must have been thinking that they were going to be able to bowl her over and make her testimony irrelevant. And instead, she takes control of that and, seals the deal. She gets the conviction.
Elizabeth became a national celebrity. One newspaper praised her class in cryptology. Another described her as a pretty woman who protects the United States. Reporters expressed surprise that one woman could take down some of the most dangerous gangsters in the country.
This is juicy stuff. These are murderers and these are people who are become household names in America. And then along comes this woman who is the key witness at the trial to get these guys thrown in prison. They don't talk about her skills. They don't talk about her brains, her ability to break these codes and to bring these gangsters to justice. They talk about how she looks, how she's dressed, that she's this dainty little woman who is bringing these big, Al Capone type mobsters to justice.
So as the clip shows us, newspaper accounts of Elizabeth's testimony focused on her physical appearance as much as, if not more than, her stunning work. Reporters were too busy marveling at her gender to really pause and take time and credit her analytical brilliance. So my question for y'all, Valeria, Kyara, and Jason, is where do we see this kind of sexism manifesting in women's contemporary experiences? And then how can people work to overcome these kind of prejudices or kind of tilts when talking about pioneering women?
You guys want to take this?
Sure.
It's a small question.
Very small.
Elizabeth's challenges, they definitely resonated with us, especially me, it's a young woman in STEM. I started my computer science journey like about 4 years ago. So when I was 13, and I hadn't expected it to be so difficult. So Valeria and I were actually fortunate enough to have like the support from our parents to take interest in computer science. And like the first time that I actually started computer science was in an all-female environment at Code of Klossy, which is an amazing program for young girls who are interested in STEM. But once I kind of transitioned to where it wasn't all female, it wasn't as supportive. And so, in the film, when she's trying, to like defend herself against attorneys, it kind of reminded me of the ways that girls today have to stand up for themselves when they're pursuing STEM fields. It isn't always easy, like sitting in a class of like 30 students and being the only girl, because you sometimes, you feel unheard and unseen. And it's really hard to put yourself out there and share your ideas when you feel that way. And I think that Elizabeth's story and the way that she, persevered through this is really relevant now.
Yeah, and especially, I think just like she had to swallow her pride, women in STEM fields as well as male-dominated fields have to do that all the time. And even like in academia, I'm sure you realized. And so there's a lot of pressure also in STEM, specifically in computer science, to not stand out too much and to not be too feminine or to not be too good at what you do or to really put yourself out there. because there's a lot of pressure on women to be perfect, because if not, you'll be seen as less than deserving to even be there, have the opportunities that are given to you. And so even though it's a very weird, delicate balancing act, and it's an interesting place to navigate, but I think like Elizabeth's story, for example, definitely watching that was just so inspirational. And even though we still have to go through that, and I'm just entering the industry, I'm feeling this way. Learning about people like her and what she was doing, honestly, very, very, very cool, very inspiring.
Yeah, that's cool.
But yeah.
You still have to navigate it today, right? I mean, she struggled at times to navigate it. Sometimes it kind of drove her crazy. I mean, the thing I think that she hated most of all was being treated as something that was exotic, which all of the newspaper coverage pretty much did. I think she wanted to be recognized as a practitioner and a scientist most of all. And so when I was setting out to write about her, I was super aware of all this, right? Because I was reading her letters every day, and I couldn't read those letters without being hyper aware that she just hated journalists, right? Like particularly male journalists. She couldn't stand them. She complains about them all the time. She's scathing about a lot of these guys and how they describe her, and I think justifiably so. And so, from my perspective as a journalist, an author, I tried to keep two main things in mind when I was writing the book. One is I tried not to make a really big deal out of the fact that Elizabeth was a working mother. I mean, it was part of her life, and I did write about it, but I didn't want to make it a focus of the book. In the same way that when you read a biography of, a famous man, it doesn't really focus on his daily interactions with his kids, right? And the second thing that I tried to do was, in writing the book, was really to invest a lot of energy into understanding and explaining why Elizabeth's work was so technically brilliant. I thought that was super important. I really wanted to try to capture her technical achievements and the wondrousness of them, because her technical, mastery was such a big part of why she was able to make such an impact on the world. And I felt like if I didn't delve into that, then I would be missing a big part of her story. And so a lot of the work that I did, a lot of the interviewing that I did, talking to real people, was talking to code breaking experts, talking to sort of technical people, to help me understand what Elizabeth did on the technical level that was so amazing, so that I could explain it to readers, and so that I wouldn't make the same mistakes that other journalists had made in talking about Elizabeth before.
So I have 8 gazillion follow-up questions. One thing I'll say first, Kyara and Valeria, is that it sounds like what you're saying is that there's a pressure within your field, and I don't know that this is just in STEM fields, but it is notable there to excel without looking like you're trying, which is a pretty impossible position to find oneself in.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's I mean, even in college, I feel that way in most of my classes, but computer science classes specifically, it's like you're even scared to ask questions during class, or you feel like you're singled out because there's so few of you there. So even in a 300-person lecture room, you will stand out just by being in that room.
The burden of representation.
Yeah, exactly. So and both of us are Latinas. And so for us, it's not only just about like representing women, but we're representing other young Latina women. And so we don't speak for either of those two categories, but often that does happen when we're in those classrooms. So
even with me, and I'm in, my computer science class only has about 30 people, and I'm one of 3 girls. So sometimes it can be really frustrating when you're trying to learn and ask questions, and sometimes it just feels like overwhelming.
Yeah, but it's fun. You get to prove them wrong.
It is fun to prove them wrong.
I mean, you guys have hinted at this, and I have the same question about y'all a little bit, and you've given some answer that I would have for Jason about Elizabeth, right? Which is like, what makes a person be inclined to be the one to be like, I know there's that barrier is there, right? But I'm just going to push at it or punch at it or skirt around it. Like, what you'd mentioned parental support or just following your curiosity, but do you have a sense of how you ended up in this field?
I mean, I think it was definitely like we were both passionate about it, but we got into it together. And I think like being there together and being able to teach others together was kind of what like kept us you know, on track, and like we were able to push each other for it.
Yeah.
And especially in school, you know, I would always look up to Valeria and I'd be like, I want to be like my sister. And then she goes to college and she starts computer science. And I'm like that's, you know, I became really passionate about it too.
Yeah, and I think like for me, being the older one, it was definitely about like my parents were just really, really pushing me to try a bunch of new things. And my dad pushed me into computer science. I really did not want to do it. But once I actually started doing it, I found it was like a really cool new creative medium to solve puzzles, just like Elizabeth. And obviously Jason can speak much more eloquently about Elizabeth and how she felt. But yeah, I think definitely at first it was intimidating, but honestly, it's kind of fun to just prove people wrong, like how we said. And it's, I don't know, it feels even more, I think it drives us a lot more that we have to prove people wrong. It can be a little bit debilitating at times, but it is something that does exist all the time, and we're happy to prove people wrong. So
it's a very powerful and potent fuel, isn't it? it's like a good thing to have in the engine. I mean, that drove Elizabeth too, 100%. I mean, all of her life, she was very aware that she was looked at skeptically by men. I think part of it is that she was just sort of very petite, and so she was dismissed from a very young age as being insignificant, right? But that drove her crazy even when she was in high school and college, and she just kind of resolved to show people that she had what it took and that she sort of deserved to be in the room. And that never really changed. That never really changed. The basic dynamic never really changed for her, though. You know, I think there was always that skepticism. She just, through her life, she just sort of developed this kind of stubborn attitude toward it, and a kind of resilience and a skin, and she pushed through it. I mean, there was some innate stubbornness that she had, I guess, but she was also very confident in her own abilities, right? She didn't brag, but she didn't back down either. And one of the fun things about researching Elizabeth was reading some of her just like completely scathing and withering appraisals of professional men in her own letters. Like she couldn't say openly to these guys' faces that she thought they were incompetent idiots, but she definitely left a record of what she thought. Right. It's what you were saying earlier, Adriane, that she did leave 22 boxes to the library, so she did have a sense that what she thought and what she said someday would really matter.
And I think just before we move on, one other thing that like really helped us specifically was organizations like Code of Klossy, and then eventually developing our own organization. Even though we didn't really know what we were doing at first, those organizations like Code of Klossy and Girls Who Code, all of these really cool or amazing organizations, they really treat you like you deserve to be there and your space is there. And it's all about like just finding your little niche in that space and just pushing through and keep going. So I think, yeah, I mean, Elizabeth sadly didn't have programs like that when she was growing up or was around, but I don't know. Now I think we're lucky to have mentors coming from places like that. So.
And I think that's an important thing. Historians always talk about change and continuity, and we started a little bit with the continuities, but those changes are meaningful, right? To have people who are there for you, to have, even if it's a tiny space, someone willing to imagine you and help you accommodate yourself in that space. That's something. I mean, when you were talking a minute ago, I was thinking that Elizabeth, she didn't have, growing up, right, a sort of a sister ally. She didn't have someone to tell her that her decision, I mean, she was kind of doing the unexpected thing. Tell me if I'm wrong, Jason, doing the unexpected thing long before she became a code breaker.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. So that's one of the fascinating things about Elizabeth to me, is that she's so unusual because she started so early. I mean, like when you look at her letters, she really didn't complain about sexism and code breaking at all when she was young, because she started in World War I, in like 1916, 1917. And in the beginning, when she began, there really weren't any code breakers at all, women, men, anyone. Like there was no NSA, there was no CIA. The FBI didn't have any code breaking ability. Even the Army didn't have code breakers back then. It's like there was no glass ceiling for women in code breaking because there was no ceiling, you know what I mean? It's like, there was no building, there was no institution. It was just like an empty open field. So just by virtue of being so good at code breaking when there were so few accomplished code breakers, Elizabeth was able to climb, you know, very fast and very far. I mean, she was one of the best code breakers in America at age 24. It's amazing to think about, but it's totally true.
And I know you didn't want to, Jason, spend a lot of time talking about her as a working mother, but the fact of the matter is that the sexism, the difficulty, like the way that gender affected her career wasn't simply in encounters with male coworkers, but in the way that other things in her life sort of slowed down possibility or openings or what have you, right? So getting married and becoming a mother changed how the 1920s looked for her. Am I wrong?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she was, her own ambitions, her own personal ambitions, and her idea of what she wanted to do with her own life was kind of thwarted time and time again by the sheer fact that she was indispensable to the U.S. government. I mean, she was so good at code breaking that the government couldn't really afford to leave her alone. I mean, she used to complain about this, you know, in the 1920s when she first started working for the Coast Guard. She had just had her first child. And what she wanted to do with her life more than anything was to be an archaeologist and kind of be an academic and be a teacher. And she had this idea that she would write children's books. She would write a book about the history of the alphabet, which was kind of a personal passion of hers. And no, she wasn't able to do any of those things really, because in 1925, men from the government started to show up on her doorstep and asking her to solve puzzles for America. And she used to complain about this bitterly. You know, men from the government keep showing up at my house and they won't go away until I solve these puzzles for them. But every time I solve these puzzles for them, they just keep coming back with a fresh envelope full of new puzzles. So that's kind of how she got pulled into this life of you know, adventure and kind of drama and achievement, was just the fact that she was too good to be left alone. But I think that if she had, you know, if she had her own choices to make, she would have made different ones.
You know, there's like a novel that's like Indiana Jones meets Robert Ludlum waiting to be written out of both her story and her like ambitions. So I'm going to just switch paces a little bit because I do want to talk. You'd mentioned CODE-EQUAL, the organization that you founded, but I just wanted to ask you to talk to the audience a little bit about it, what it is, how you see it bearing on the conversation that we're having, or on the way that you would like the field to develop.
Yeah, of course. So as I started taking computer science classes, because I'm older, I noticed that I was one of the only girls in the classroom, also the only Latina in the classroom. There was maybe one other Black girl, and that was pretty much the extent of the diversity in that room. And when Kyara started taking computer science classes, we noticed this was always a thing. And we had known, but we had never experienced it. And so instead of waiting around really for this to change, because it's going to take, it still hasn't happened fully, we decided to try and see at least some change within our own community by creating CODE-EQUAL, which is the nonprofit that we started. And Kyara can describe it.
So yeah, CODE-EQUAL is a nonprofit that provides free CS courses, mentors, workshops, hackathons, and the tools that self-identifying girls and underrepresented minorities need to enter the CS field with confidence and knowledge to succeed. So we actually started out with 2 computer science courses at our local library. So we had Girl Code and Code-It, which Girl Code was just for girls, and then Code-It was our gender inclusive class. And we actually ended up having, we had a lot of students and we had a lot of, good feedback on it. So we ended up doing it like every week instead of every other week. And then our classes kept expanding and growing. And we started to teach workshops in different places like the Bronx. And it was just a really cool experience to be able to kind of see other girls going through the same experience that we went through with Code with Klossy, but being able to provide that for them was really fulfilling.
Yeah, and then now we also do workshops. We did the first New Jersey Congressional App Challenge hackathon. I interned for my congresswoman freshman year of college, and so I learned about the Congressional App Challenge, which is like Congress's attempt to actually get students curious in STEM. And so they didn't have any hackathon for it, and we ended up organizing it for them in partnership with their office. And
for
that
the
was
sake
really
of
cool.
the olds, will you tell us what a hackathon is?
Yes. Thank you for asking. We always forget. Yes, but a hackathon is actually, it's a very cool opportunity for, it can be 12 to 24 to 36 hours. It's basically a really cool space where students or anyone who's interested in computer science, coding, you name it, just creating, with the intersection of technology, they can all go to one space. They have mentors. And basically what you're supposed to do within the time frame set for you is to have an entire app or robot or whatever you make done by the deadline. And then there's judging. And once the judging is over, you can get prizes. Some bigger hackathons actually have internships as prizes or money. But yeah, it's very cool.
Yeah,
but
I remember my first hackathon. I think it was like 36 hours. And I was like 15. So I was like, oh my God, 36 hours. I have to be like coding and like hacking, and I don't know what I'm doing, but I ended up having a lot of fun. And I was with Valeria. So
I took her with me to Boston.
She's like, come on, we're going to do a hackathon. I was like, what's a hackathon? I was like, 36 hours in one place. But it was really fun.
Yeah, but basically CODE-EQUAL, it's a nonprofit, so we can provide opportunities for students because a lot of what we saw is the reason why there's such a gap in these computer science classrooms is also because of socioeconomic status. And so students aren't able to get computer science exposure until they reach maybe even college. So a lot of my friends in my computer science classes hadn't even touched coding until they got to Princeton. So it was really about offering free resources for students and even mentoring. And now we're working on a fellowship idea so that we can combine both. We can be more socially conscious with the technology that we're creating. And so we're working on that, and we're really excited. So that's a little bit about CODE-EQUAL. Yeah.
That's lovely. I'm so delighted by y'all. And I'll say it's exposure, and then also, having people do it so that they can imagine themselves doing it. I remember even as a history major thinking about graduate school and saying, oh, people like me don't go to graduate school, and pointing to some guy who was literally wearing tweed as a college undergrad and being like, that guy, people like that guy go to graduate school. So it's also about allowing it to be imaginable, allowing different possibilities and futures to be imaginable for people.
Yeah, exactly. And also part of it is that computer science and cryptology seems super intimidating at first. And I know I was very scared about going into it and even trying it. And so what we're trying to do really is to get students who wouldn't likely think about computer science as an opportunity for them to accomplish what they want to do or something they have never imagined, but it's just to introduce students to offer opportunities, mentorship, and even understanding that computer science is not just a bunch of random numbers on a screen, but you can actually create really cool applications or products to help with social impact and even racial, social justice, climate change, anything. So
yeah, and one of the ways that we kind of introduced coding to our students is we showed them how many ways it could be used, and that you can kind of bring in, if you have a passion for art, you can use computer science to create art. So that was something that we showed our students, and something that really kept them engaged and wanted them to keep pursuing it.
And we're young, so we're close to their age. So it's fun. Yeah.
Elizabeth would love talking to the two of you so much.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I just think she would see herself in you. One of the things that Elizabeth did whenever she talked in public or spoke to a group, which she did after World War II, she never talked about the spy stuff that she did in World War II, but she talked about other parts of her career. And the first thing that she always did in these speeches was she tried to do exactly what you're talking about, to demystify the idea of code breaking and to emphasize that it's not this sort of elite technical world that's occupied by, shamans or something. It's actually, code breaking is something that everybody can kind of understand on an intuitive level. And she would break it down, and she would show people you actually do know what a code is. You know what a cipher is. She would tell groups in ballrooms, at hotel ballrooms, she'd say a code is just one thing that stands for another thing. If you've ever looked at a child's report card, A stands for good, F stands for bad. That's a code. if you've ever sort of written a love note to a crush in school, where you set A equal to B and B equal to C and C equal to D, and you pass it to your crush. Do you like me? Yes or no? Then all that is a cipher. And so it's not some inaccessible world. It is some kind of world that you can, that you can play with and sort of open up and see what's inside in this kind of hackathon sense. You can sort of interrogate it. You can get under the hood and you can sort of claim some of that power for yourself. So yeah, absolutely. I think that you guys in a lot of ways are Elizabeth's spiritual descendants, and I think
thank you.
I think that is a lovely place to make a transition. And so we're going to turn to question and answer. If you have questions, please continue to send them along. I'm going to start with one that speaks straight to my historian's heart. My historian's art. It is art, but it's also science. It's for Jason, and it says, can you talk a bit about the archival research or the archival search for resources? Friedman has such a large span of associations throughout her work, with the federal government, the military, the civil service, private, riverbank, etc. Can you say a little bit about where you had to go and what you had to do?
Oh my gosh, yeah, this is by far my favorite part of the project. Writing, not so much fun. Actually, writing the book, not fun. Doing archival research, super fun, and I couldn't get enough of it. So I told you about the 22 boxes in Elizabeth's collection that are at the Marshall Foundation Library. It's a wonderful set of materials, but it only covered about up to 1936 or 1937. And then, there was this big sort of gap in years where World War II was supposed to be, and then the materials picked up again after World War II and sort of into her retirement. So when I was first working on the book and looking at those 22 boxes, I was actually really worried that a book about Elizabeth wasn't going to be achievable just because there was nothing in World War II. Nobody knew where those records were. And so I had to really go hunting for those. It ended up taking me about 1.5 years to find them. And what that looked like was really just like me driving every week or every other week from my house in the Philadelphia area down to National Archives 2 in College Park. I was part of the National Archives system. And if you've ever done research in the National Archives system, you know that it's kind of one of the last places in the world that isn't digitized. There's no Googleability to it. So you really just have to fill out these kind of archaic slips and request physical boxes and hope that the thing that you're looking for comes back. So it was a lot of that. It was a lot of digging through files in the National Archives system. And in other libraries too, in New York Public Library and other places. And a lot of it too was suppressing my own sense of excitement when I would find something cool, because when you're in a library, you're not supposed to make any noise. You're not supposed to like jump up and down and cheer and say like, I found it, because people will get really irritated with you. So I had to teach myself how to do archival research in the course of the project, but it was by far my favorite part of doing it.
I'm sure the archivist would have been thrilled to see you thrilled
Would they have?
at their holdings. And it is a reminder, God bless archivists.
God bless archivists, yes.
And the National Archives, because we could not do what we do without them.
Amen.
This is also a question for you, Jason. When Elizabeth Smith Friedman's true life, or the unknown part of her life was finally revealed, what was the impact on her family? Do you know?
That's a good question. I don't think that her family ever knew what she did in World War II, really, or at least they didn't know the extent of it. I mean, what she did during World War II was a top secret, literally top secret mission on behalf of the FBI and other agencies to systematically monitor secret radio stations that had been set up in South America by Nazi spies who were gathering information on the Allies to try to defeat them. And so Elizabeth had to break, more than 50 different codes on 50 radio stations, solve thousands of messages, and one by one just sort of track these Nazi spies across an entire continent, which she successfully did. And then after the war, J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI stepped in and took credit for all of that stuff that Elizabeth and her Coast Guard team had done. And not only did they, take credit for it in public, but at the same time, all of her files were stamped with this big, scary-looking black stamp that said "Top Secret Ultra," and they were shipped off to classified portions of the National Archives system, and they were only declassified in like 2008, I think. And so I don't think that there would have been any way for her kids to know that she was a World War II hero. It's possible that William knew, that they had private conversations, but I think it's completely plausible that they never understood the extent of her heroism in that war.
May we also say that in the part of the documentary, and I presume in the book, when he talks about the FBI kind of taking credit for her accomplishments, it was about the millionth time. As a historian, I've read something and gone, J. Edgar Hoover.
He really was the worst, wasn't he?
It's just, yeah, it was a very upsetting moment for me. This question comes to us from Canada, and it is for Kyara and Valeria. It says 65% of our students are young women. Is the CODE-EQUAL program accessible for Canadian students?
Yeah, actually, because of the pandemic, even though obviously it's terrible and it's been really difficult for doing what we do, we actually did transition a lot of our stuff online. And so we have weekly online classes still. If you go to our website, CODE-EQUAL.com, you can find that. And also we have different, what's it called? What is the word? Tutorials on our YouTube, yes. And then we will have other opportunities coming out. So yeah, thank you for the question. Definitely accessible for
our
them.
fellowship.
Yes.
That will be coming out soon.
Say that again in case anyone didn't hear. Look for your fellowship, you said?
Yes, we're
working on
a fellowship program.
Yeah, all about the intersection of policy and tech and social responsibility, as well as create. Yeah, it's coming out. We're working on it.
The intersection of policy and tech. Who's been thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's something we really need to, we desperately need to invest in. So I'm majoring in public policy and computer science, and so really trying hard to bring those two into it. So yeah.
And thank you for that. This question is also for y'all. My daughter is an engineering student, not mine, the questioners. My daughter is an engineering student, so she's used to being the minority in her STEM classes and being talked over by her male classmates. I'm wondering if Valeria and Kyara have seen any good ways that professors can make sure that female students are included in the conversation.
Well, this is always a fun one. Thank you for the question. Do you want me to take this or? Yeah. So in my classes, my lectures, this happens all the time, even in my non-engineering computer science classrooms. I've actually had a conversation with professors and preceptors, if sometimes this happened once in one of my classrooms and just kept happening over and over again. And it wasn't even just me raising my hand being ignored. But I think sometimes professors don't even realize what they're doing. It's a lot about unconscious bias and just overlooking their female students. So I think just the best way to go about it is to actually just try and have a conversation, a respectful conversation with that professor or preceptor, whoever it is. But also just not making yourself small, because I realized at first when I was a freshman, I was really trying to be almost invisible in my classroom because I felt uncomfortable and I felt like I wasn't welcome and wasn't supposed to be there. And so I think it's also just about students, like female students who are feeling overlooked, just making sure that they don't get ignored. And if their hand gets ignored, to keep raising their hand over and over again. And so it just makes it uncomfortable for them to not ignore you at that point.
And I think also from like the teacher's perspective, I think since we've like been through it and we understand that, I think we're really good with our students in terms of like we try to get everyone involved. And I think that not having a teacher that is like that and who understands is really frustrating. So it's really important to just like push for it.
Yeah, make yourself not impossible to ignore.
And again, and I mean, it requires so much on the part of the student, right? I mean, this question began with what should others do to help stop this from happening broadly? And you're right, talking to the professor, like even raising a hand, makes it hard to be ignored, but we should acknowledge that the burden still, like all our solutions are putting the burden on the person who's struggling. But knowing, you know, what you said, you deserve to be where you are, right? Wherever you are,
exactly.
you deserve to be there, and don't question that and start from there.
I think it's also just a lot about talking with your classmates, and like if you have friends in that class and they're not being ignored, sometimes they can just pass the question on to you. And so if they raise their hand and they get called on, they'll be like, actually, my friend over here has a question. So I've actually had to do that before. So I think honestly, just finding allies within your classroom is very, very helpful too. So
I remember reading an article about people who worked for Al Gore when he was vice president, women staffers who made a point of doing that for other women staffers because they were being ignored or talked over. And so a person would say, oh, I think so-and-so had a question, or so-and-so had a follow-up on this point. Next question, how long did it take to create Code-EQUAL?
It didn't take long. I think we had already had a lot of experience with volunteering. We had been in volunteering since Valeria was 7 and I was like 4. So we had a lot of like connections to our public library. So we actually started there, which was really nice. So it didn't take long.
Yeah, we started in 2017, and since then we've been teaching regularly, offering these opportunities. I think it didn't take long to really create the nonprofit. To get the nonprofit status did take some time. We had to get a lawyer to help us do register pro bono. But I think as long as like someone's driven and motivated, and I mean, also we were very lucky because we had already connections within our community. So we do have to acknowledge we had a lot of help and support. But yeah, I mean, did not take super long, and we're still growing. So really, we're still going.
You said we're just getting started. Jason, what's next up on your writing agenda?
I have a full-time job now. I'm not working for myself or writing books. I am the narrative writer for the San Francisco Chronicle. So I'm a newspaper reporter. So I work on some daily and breaking stories, but mostly sort of long-term, like magazine type stories for the San Francisco Chronicle. So I'm trying to be the best newspaper reporter that I can be. But yeah, I mean, I'm always sort of on the lookout for an inspiring book idea. I've come to kind of worry that I won't ever find an idea that just seized me like you know, with the power that this one did. It was kind of too good to be true, but it turned out to be completely true. So I do have this fear that I won't ever have another moment like the moment I described of going into the vault and starting to read Elizabeth's records, but I do hope that I will.
You'll have another moment that will be awesome, even if it's different.
I hope so.
During World War II, Jason, was there any connection between Elizabeth's work and the work of the British at Bletchley Park? Do you know?
Yes, that's a great question. So Elizabeth was not part of the main sort of thrust of the Bletchley code-breaking program, but she was in contact with kind of a subset of the Bletchley codebreakers who were focused on German Enigma machines and Enigma codes that were used specifically by German spies. So, within this huge sort of Allied code breaking program, there were these little kind of islands. There was one island in the United States in the Coast Guard that was Elizabeth's team, and then there was this island, within Bletchley. But these two islands were kind of communicating with each other through secret cables. And specifically focused on trying to break the codes of Nazi spies. And so there are actually some I was able to find some cables that were sent back and forth between Elizabeth's team and the Bletchley team, and they were both trying to sometimes break the same Enigma machine used by the same set of spies at the same time. So it actually became like a competition between the Americans and the British to see who could break it first. And they got a little salty with each other sometimes when, the British thought that they broke it first, and then Elizabeth's team thought that they broke it first. So yeah, that was the link.
That's nice. Productive and friendly rivalry. So our final question is a kind of big open question, and that is, what gaps remain in the historical record related to women in code breaking or STEM? This person would love to see more about the World War II Black Code Girls, for example, and William Coffey's efforts.
That's a really good question and an important one going forward, I think. I don't know if I know enough to say where the gaps are specifically, but I know that they're there. They must be there because one of the huge things that doing this project and all this research on Elizabeth taught me is that when you go back and look at the historical records, and Adriane, you could probably chime in and say like, yeah, but and I'm sure that you have experience with this too. But when you go back and you look at the historical records, you realize that women in marginalized groups had been doing this work all along. It's not that they weren't there; it's that they were there, but they were just doing this work in invisible ways, right? Like they didn't get paid for it, they didn't get recognized for it, but they were there. And when you look at the documents and you actually hold the pieces of paper, you see that, oh yeah, they were there. They were there the whole time. It's just that the public didn't know that they were there. So for me, that was a huge takeaway from this story. So I'm sure that there's all kinds of stories that are just waiting to be discovered by anyone who has the sort of time and energy and excitement to go into the archives and find them.
And the tenacity. And you're right. And this is, if you know people who need research projects, high school students, college students, folks who have good local libraries or time on their hands. I mean, it is exactly as you described your process. You start by thinking about one thing and realizing that good knowledge produces more questions, and a good question could produce surprising answers. And you just go looking and you go digging, and bang, something new.
That's really well said.
And with that, y'all, we have come to the end of our discussion. Thank you so much, Jason, Kyara, Valeria, for joining us this evening. And I'm going to turn it back over to Cameo George for closing remarks. Thank y'all.
Thank you again for joining us today for this important and timely conversation. Our film, The Codebreaker, is available to stream in full on AmericanExperience.org. You can watch any of our virtual conversations anytime on our YouTube channel and on our website. Thank you again. Have a great evening.